Good afternoon. I'm Julia Coakley, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, which is being presented by Morning Data. Before I introduce our presenter, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen, which will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time and don't have an opportunity to put your question to our speaker, this will be answered post-event. Your camera and microphone are already muted, so again, please use the chat box for your question. This presentation is accredited for CPD points if it's relevant to your ongoing professional development, and the video will be available on our website and the MGAA YouTube channel post-event. Please take time to respond to our feedback survey, which will be issued after this webinar, as this will enable us to deliver the best quality events to our membership. So today's webinar, Core Data, the Countdown to a Clearer Tomorrow, is being delivered by Kirstin Duffield, CEO of Morning Data and Technical Subject Matter Expert Advisor to the Chair of the Data Council. Kirstin is at the forefront of technical innovation and data usage within the London and company insurance markets, and over the last couple of years has been able to use platforms such as the MGAA to help educate the insurance market on the benefits of data and how a central collection is necessary to allow the free-flowing transfer of data between organisations. So Kirstin, if I might hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so welcome everybody. As introduced, Core Data, the Countdown to a Clearer Tomorrow. And just picking up the learning objectives, we'll just start with making sure that we know what those are and that we are in a position to indicate that they have a number of items that you will be able to put down as your CDP points. So by the end, we want to be able to summarise the value of data and how it should be considered, not to be considered a burden, but rather an asset, and to describe how to enrich data with minimal effort. It probably inevitably involves your technologists either internally or from your suppliers. To list examples of how to complete data so it can be transferred to external parties, and also to outline why communication is key to the evolution of the industry. So let's kick off with the value of data, and it's inevitable the first thing anybody does, whether they're interested in the topic or whether they are preparing to do a webinar, is that you'll Google value of data. And it returns inevitably, as you would imagine, a rather large hit rate in terms of the number of items. But it also returns it in 0.58 seconds, something we often overlook really when we're using Google. We're just accustomed now to this enormous amount of data being returned to us in a fraction of a second. And this really comes about the organisation and the structure of the data that it's returning. So long since the beginning of the internet, it's been building up, and there's bots and all sorts of other stuff, trolling through the internet in order to create indexes that make returning that data as efficient as we've become accustomed to. In fact, actually, it's something we sort of almost don't even think about these days, and we just assume that everybody else and every other system can operate at that kind of speed. And in 2020, we've only just part, there was estimated to be approximately 64 zettabytes of data on the internet, and it's predicted to rise to 181 zettabytes. And just for the record, a zettabyte is a trillion gigabytes, just in case you're getting, we're going to have to invent a lot more names as we're growing the data on a day-to-day basis. But more importantly, I think for our future as an industry, and by that obviously we're talking about that insurance service and intermediary service for the MGAs and the brokers, is that our future market will be even more digitally active, and they predict that 9 out of 10 people over the age of 6 years will be digitally active by 2030. And this means that their first port of call is going to be their device of choice in their hands, for example, for more or less everything that they do. And the pandemic has probably accelerated that with our online shopping prowess and these kinds of things becoming more normal. So really, we can interpret data on a day-to-day basis very naturally in a lot of cases, certainly in an educated community. But what we're really moving forward to is being able to interpret the written language that might exist in templates, in documents, and particularly for the insurance industry, those contracts, those the verbose part. And that's really what perhaps the next junction is going to be around things such as computable contracts. So the data-powered MGA, we have our audience here of MGAs, and I think it's really important to understand what that really means. Looking at various surveys, and with any of these things, data can be spun in a number of ways. Certainly, one reputable survey talked about 41% of MGAs and insurers commenting that their data executives align with overall business strategy. Well, great. What's frightening is that means the inverse is not aligned, and that's obviously perhaps distinctly more concerning. In the same way as 18% of insurance organisations surveyed believe that they have tools, people, processes, etc. to be able to support data-driven apps. But that again means the inverse is quite considerably operating in a different way and has some catch-up to do. But certainly with my hat on advising within the LMA, one of the largest areas that has really sort of come to the fore in that journey, talking to MGAs, brokers and carriers across the market, is that it's a cultural issue far more than a technological issue. The tools are there and relatively inexpensive these days, although in fairness you may require changes to your core elements which might require some investment. The ability to leverage collecting data with outside sources, even free data sources, has exponentially grown in recent years. And so that culture around, well, it's not my job or what's in it for me, is a very valid one, particularly amongst the stakeholders talking about, well, what is the return on the investment, etc. But perhaps that is only part of the discussion. Perhaps there's a bigger discussion to have about what I could do with this data. If I have to collect it, I might as well then double use it or treble use it over and over again, then returning that on that investment. So let's look at some of the ways in which data is used, maybe in slightly more unexpected manners. So I always like my analysing data, the data of cows. It's apparently well known in Gloucestershire and Wiltshire that cows have been now adorned with pedometers. And apparently it's essential to be able to collate the step count of a herd, as apparently when a heifer is on heat, she is a lot more active and walks a lot more. So we could say that an active heifer is a ready heifer. But particularly here, this allows the small farmers with limited number of staff, maybe a single farmer looking after large herds for economies of scale, being able to be better prepared and better informed about their herd and being able to leverage that data. But perhaps it's not something that's in everybody's day-to-day life. So perhaps moving to something the majority of people are familiar with, which is obviously the absolute certainty that babies come from storks. Now this sort of goes and sort of moves more into what we do with the data that we might collect. And here we obviously end up at the end of the game in the world of statistics. And so we have to be careful about what we do with the data in context of what we're trying to get as an outcome from it. Now, where does the statement babies come from storks, or the assertion that it does? There have been a large number of papers and books that have been written on the value of data and relying on the wrong data. And there's a fantastic book by Darrell Huff, whose best-selling book about statistics is largely thought to be almost the best one ever written. And however daft we might think, in fact, actually this study was used in the attempt to disprove that smoking caused lung cancer. So it is actually quite a sort of serious concept. And how do we deal with this? Well, what they did in this analysis of the data that was collected was that they proved that in countries that had high annual number of babies being born, they also had a high number of mating pairs of storks, and the inverse was equally able to be correlated. As such, you could glean something we, in logical sense, might quite happily poo-poo and say that was obviously a bit daft. But the same technique has been used time and time again by choosing items of data that are then maybe misused or misinterpreted. So we're talking about the core data, the collection of data, which is really at the front end. And this is talking all about what we do with the data up the far end. But if we don't keep an eye on both ends of this journey, it becomes very difficult to decide what data is going to be valuable to collect and therefore have the argument and the discussion about the return on investment, and then be able to actually realize that return on investment as we use that data. So we've really got to keep an eye on both ends of the journey. Now, we've seen this exact same scenario sort of manifest itself out during COVID. Just taking one good example, which is that when we went through the vaccination program, if the population is not vaccinated at all, it could be proved that the percentage of hospitalizations with people who would be vaccinated would be 0. The inverse, therefore, would be gleaned that 100%, if the country was 100% vaccinated, then it would mean 100% of hospitalizations will be vaccinated people, which makes great headlines for BBC News, but not a very clear understanding of what we're doing with that data and why we're collecting it. And I do recall having a distinct faceplant moment on the pavement with this discussion with one of my son's neighbours, as they were absolutely convinced that vaccinations were the wrong thing to do based on that exact same headline. So core data in itself, what do we really mean about it? Well, let's take something like a bank. We're very accustomed to handing over quite a bit of information about ourselves as individuals, and let's focus on individuals here, but obviously the same in different ways applies in the corporate world. We could pretty well understand that if we passed on our name, our address, possibly with a previous address, and our date of birth, the bank could reasonably easily use that data across multiple systems, and they could use that data to potentially cross-sell to maybe even unrelated products, to perform sanctions checking, credit checking, all sorts of things that limited amount of data would be able to leverage. So we're quite accustomed to this, and going back many years, we don't find this very new. So why is the concept of core data being common across an entire insurance market being met with some wide eyes and some hesitation? Well, as with the bank, we really need to understand how we can benefit from enriching that data, and this is the difference that has happened in the recent years. This is where it's much more manageable to the modest-sized enterprise to be able to leverage data. So, how do we enrich it? Well, certainly we need a hook, and in the banking scenario, that hook is that combination of the absolute minimum data to uniquely identify somebody. Obviously, once we then assign a policy number or a bank account number, that number becomes the absolute, the really single most verified item that groups those elements together. But in insurance, we're equally going to need a hook, both a hook about the insured, the hook about the intermediary, the hook about the insurable interests. So, for example, let's start with the concept of what that hook's going to enable us to do. And we could consider it, as a colleague volunteered to me the other day as part of this presentation, to consider it as some kind of power-up. And in the gaming world, we would be quite accustomed to this idea, but just to imagine and visualize this, we could be thinking that we type in the name of a company. Admittedly, there may be several Ace taxis in Birmingham, but once we've sort of discerned which one we're interested in, that data, that core data, could be leveraged through APIs and maybe potentially request information from something like Companies House. Now, obviously, that's only going to work for UK registered companies, but there are data sources around the world at different levels of sophistication to be able to reduce the number of clicks the users in your organisations would have to undergo. It may come back with a number of matching records. The user may indeed need to just validate that this is the right ACE taxes, but this now opens up the ability to retrieve a lot more information. Imagine, for example, in Mario, that your shell power-up, which turns Mario into a shell Mario, is being able to defend against most attacks. He's also able to swim faster under more control. Definition from Wikipedia. I confess I'm not a current Mario Kart player, but perhaps this is akin in our world here to defending against compliance breaches and making informed decisions faster. It doesn't take a leap to understand, how we can parallel these concepts. When we talk about APIs, and here just for the record, obviously API stands for an application program interface. It's a piece of code. It's not magic, but it does allow you to potentially gather or exchange data relatively easily. The calling system needs to identify themselves, and we call that an API key, and they need to match some of that criteria, that core data, depending on the nature of the API. It may be more or less in terms of what's required, and then the data can be returned, or the data that you're sending can be inputted into the destination. So now let's think about ecosystems, and I'm sure everybody has spent a lot of time reading on LinkedIn or their fellow people in the market with details, discussions, etc. about application ecosystems or the ecosystem that they work within. But here we're talking about a data ecosystem. And it's more a question of the fact that we have got potentially multiple sources of this data, and we may want to use that data for multiple purposes. There may be multiple external open data sources as well. Certainly if you consult the ODI, an organisation particularly focused on this, it gives you huge amounts of resources of open data sources, although they should be treated with some circumspect in terms of quality and completeness, etc. But it does mean that you can not necessarily have to always sign up to a very expensive source of data, where there are now an ever-increasing number of open data sources and low-cost data sources to leverage, and almost all that you would expect to hold considerable size amounts of data will have APIs these days for you to be able to connect to. And just in case anyone wants to use the lingo, do remember that the API is where you are going to send your data to, and it's going to be like the gatekeeper. It's going to test what it is that you're sending and let you through or not, rather than using an API to send data. I mean, it's just semantics, but we would send data out of a system to an API. It would be judged. The gatekeeper would allow us to go in, submit data, or call data back. So let's look at a practical example. If I was to consider looking for a policy to cover some direct yacht, for example, and I go to, I've got a proposal form and it has the name of the insured, the name of the yacht, and a very limited amount of data on there, nothing that I could really use. So I then turn to my good old favourite Google, and I therefore look up, and in this case we're using the Aviva as a lookup for a yacht. And Google very generously, very quickly returns to us 2 records. And you can see the data in here. We've got links that will give us the Aviva, and we can see that there must by implication be 2 vessels that return and respond to that name. They happen to both be called Aviva, and you have got different lengths, and you have got the fact that the first one was drafted as the Aviva 3, and the second one written in English, she is the 4th yacht. It does pose some complications about how to use this data as to be able to pull the data back from Wikipedia in this way if the data is captured in different forms. So let's take the journey on a little bit further and compare those 2 records side by side. Now when we're looking at it, we can see that this got some structure around it. It's got the fact that it has the name, and here we're looking at the 2007 68 metre vessel on the left, and we have got the 2017 98 metre record on the right. So notes are intrinsically and always a question of being a bit of a challenge to be able to do much with, but we do have some nice interesting information in the middle here. We have an IMO number and an MMSI number for both vessels, and in fact the call sign has been included on the Wikipedia site for this shorter vessel here. So what we don't have visible on this screen at this moment is, say, the length, the gross tonnage, the dead weight, or the year of, well, we do have the year of build, but the additional information that might be behind that. And it may or may not reside in something like Wikipedia, and as this is publicly able to be edited, we perhaps shouldn't be using Wikipedia as one of our chosen external sources that we might leverage quality data from. So we've covered the fact that it's an application programming interface. It is just code. But I'm going to take you through an example of leveraging this in an example application. And whilst doing it, we're going to look at the difference between using cookies and APIs, as it's a common mistake or trip up that people might be lulled into, whether they're using APIs or whether they're using cookies to populate data. So cookies are items of data saved within your profile or your browser or your computer. And you often get asked whether you need to clear down cookies if your computer gets into a little bit of a 2 and 8. And it does help you auto-populate data that you have stored because you have keyed it in previously. But it doesn't really necessarily conform to the structure of the system or the application or the website that you're going to put the data into this time. Whereas APIs are a kind of, as I said, handshake. It's where one system identifies themselves, sends the package of data, and can either insert that data into that system, or it can request data back for its own use, or both. So I haven't previously done a dynamic recording on one of these webinars, so hopefully it will starts to unfold itself when I click this play button. What we're looking at here is just a very straightforward, very basic, low-code sort of quote and bind system, and we're going to start the recording off, and you'll notice that I'm not controlling the mouse here, so I shall stop it if I need to halfway through. We're selecting a particular binder that I am able to use. We're going to go through and confirm that we're using the direct yacht binder here. We're going to select a company as being who we are. We're going to start selecting. These are the cookies. So here we can see just on the screen that the data that is being requested, it's offering you a helping hand. So it's given you the various things that you might have used previously, and I'm going to select my corporate email address off the top, and I am then going to continue the journey. So you'll see at the bottom that it has put in the address May House, Bridport Road. It hasn't split the data down any further to put Bridport Road on the next line, for example. So I now continue moving through. I'm now going to choose the country. Now by choosing the country, I can now assist the system to be able to be a little bit more precise in what it's going to do. Now we can really hone in on perhaps leveraging some external data. And in this case, we're going to, it also cookies at this point, but once I've done that, oh, apologies, let's go back. Let's go forwards a little bit. Bear with me. Here we go. So once I've selected the company, I've gone through selecting my cookie information, just simply to speed it up, a little bit of a repeat here, and watch the address as I progress through to choose the country, and then the company name from my cookies. But now the Google API is going to fire. You'll see it on the screen. It's giving me only 2 matches of the address. And now it has designed and put the data in a more structured way. So it's leveraged getting that data to be repeatable and structured and putting in the right items in the right fields. You'll also notice at the bottom that it's also simultaneously gone off and returned what 3 words. The method of doing that is that the Google API returns silently in the background the long and lat of that address, and there is a free service to be able to turn that and query that into the API from what 3 words to return the match for that address. So progressing forwards, we're now going to take the next stage in this, which is to discuss about how this API has worked in that particular example. So Imagine that we are going to a restaurant, we're ordering food, and we know that we've got a kitchen that will prepare that food. The API is effectively the ordering bit in between. It's the waiter that junctions you between the two. So the kitchen is a bit like the server, and the response is the order or the food from that kitchen. So the kinds of things that won't work is, instead of ordering food, for example, if you were to try and order a mobile phone, the waiter in the kitchen would deny your request. You will only get food in the restaurant that is on the menu, and you won't get any mobile phones. You would get a proper response if and only if it's available on the server. Otherwise, you will get errors or failures. So it should be noted that a comment I heard some months ago, which is, well, when we have APIs, we won't need standards. Actually, really, one has to think that an API is a standard in its own right. It is being the controller, the gatekeeper, to being able to take this forwards. So let's pick up the story again. Now we are through to the next stage of our quote and bind. We've got our binder. We have chosen that it's the direct yacht binder. We've identified what the address is. So now we're going to take it through and we're going to add a vessel. And this uses an API going to something called marine traffic. Now, interestingly, those two IMO numbers that we had previously, one of them works and one of them doesn't. And this is quite a classic example of how to show what is happening. That is a valid IMO number, but it returns no results. And I'll talk through why in a moment. Whereas if I put the other IMO number in, of the other Aviva vessel, you will see that it returns a fully fledged result. It confirms, is this the vessel that you want? All that data has come back instantaneously through the API, and I can select that vessel. We'll add it to my record. I can scroll down, mark the address as being the same as the insured if that's relevant, and then I can look at all that data that's come straight back into my system. I've got the vessel flag, I've got the dead weight, I have got its vessel beam, all of this data, which ironically is some of the data required in the London market core data record, which we'll come to. So we've been able to leverage very few clicks to being able to retrieve that data. Our next stage is, just seems when I go to this that I've got to get to the very end and then move forwards. There we go. So now let's cover why we got no records returned for the valid IMO number that was given on Wikipedia, which does belong to the Aviva. But you'll notice on the left-hand side that two vessels share the same MMSI number, and that's not uncommon in the marine world. So what we can conclude is, despite the fact that on the application, when I go on the website and I look at marine traffic and type in an IMO number, it will give me back the one vessel. In the API, it is coded that it needs a unique matchup of MMSI number and IMO number. In other words, 1-to-1. We can't have an IMO number which has a MSSI number which is used on another vessel as well. So the API is actually therefore easy to spot that it is coded subtly differently from the web interface at marine traffic. And that's the kind of thing that you need to be aware of when thinking about how to get data out of a system. So what have we done so far? We've used Google, Wikipedia, and we've established that there are two vessels that would come back. If I take it on one level further, what I've got is I've selected one of these vessels. I have therefore retrieved its IMO number. I put the IMO number in. I can then retrieve the call sign, the flag, the dead weight, the build year, etc. for use in my core system. Because the vessel owner is on there, I can then silently leverage perhaps an additional API off the back of that to go to company's house, perhaps combined if the owner is registered in the UK. And from that, I can return the company number, which now unlocks things like the date founded, the date of last filing, list of directors. And if you happen to have an onboarding exercise where you are collecting data and you're asking this data of your agents, of your insureds, and you could now perhaps prevent them or reduce the number of pieces of information they supply by use of APIs, it really gives them a cuddly feeling. It makes them feel as though all this data is nice and slick and straightforward, and we can leave those paper, if not PDF documents, to enroll people on as parties that we're doing business with, and we can leave that behind. So let's take that on one step further. We've now picked up the journey with company's house for the company number. We've unfolded various things, and we can now daisy chain these APIs off each other to be able to bring back what 3 words, maybe run credit reports and do sanctions checking, all from a very small amount of data that was actually entered in at the beginning. So when the London market or any market talks about brokers and MGA supplying more data, I think it's really the time to think about how to reduce the amount of input data you're using and to use the data that is being required of you as a sort of guiding light as to what data you could focus on in getting out of using APIs. So here's a sort of representation. You might have an API engine within your operations. You may have some kind of low-code workbench, for example, quote and bind. You've got your core system. Obviously, that data may then funnel through to your core system and into its operational database. Perhaps you've got a reporting database that you actually run your MI off and combine with other third-party sources. But both of these systems could be pinging backwards and forwards and getting data out of third-party suppliers. Now, when we go to what data should we be recalling, do remember that there are some times when it's a good idea to be very careful about what you record. So we obviously had that distinctly brought into our focus around the GDPR initiative some years ago. Earlier, a few months ago, I saw a LinkedIn post about security and the use of mothers' maiden names being used in banking passwords, something I'm sure we're all very aware of. And I decided to see how easy it was to get this piece of information for the person who had posted that particular post. Now, I have a little bit of an inside leg here because my hobby is actually in genealogy, so I do have access to knowing where to find this data relatively simply, but it is public domain information. I looked at the individual's LinkedIn profile. I noted the year that they left or appeared to leave school and the location of that school. I checked the electoral roll because I deemed they would probably within a year be on the electoral roll using the surname for that year or the year after. And I did find that that person and other household members, and was able to cross-reference with publicly available birth and marriage index, and responded directly to the individual within about 10 or 12 minutes, asking him whether his mother's maiden name was. I did replace it for public domain, but I did say privately, was it his mother's maiden name. Now that did really focus his mind that perhaps he would immediately go in and change all his banking passwords. So for anyone on the call who still uses their mother's maiden name as their banking password, not a good idea. So we have then brought on to sort of the last part of today's presentation, and it's all about communication, and onto an area which you may have heard about currently, which is the core data record within the London market for those that are placing business into the London market. But it's really only one example of data that perhaps individual carriers may be asking of you outside the London market. And this is all about communication. It's how one system talks to another. And the first step within the approval of the CDR within London was to ensure that we could undergo the process using standards. Now, in the insurance industry, our insurance standards body is largely a CORD with some additional geographical information such as country codes, currency codes and things like that supplied by ISO. So if we could get agreement that the common standard would be using a CORD nomenclature, we would call, the inception date of a policy would always be within these APIs called the same thing. It suddenly unlocks this common language that enables you to move data from A to B. Creating your own standards makes you the individual problem. After all, Alexander Graham Bell needed somebody to call the other end, and hence why we're all wandering around with mobile phones. So this is really not about standards and proprietary information making it your USP. In fact, it's making you your Achilles heel. So we need to take, it takes an entire market to be revolutionary when we're dealing with multiple participants and subscription markets, etc. So it's really important that we're moving through as a group. Your USPs are in other areas, not whether you are talking the same language to transmit data. So that Accord and ISO standards you'll be more than familiar with. Currency codes, dialing codes, etc. are all very well known. After all, you wouldn't really take on the idea of inventing a new currency code or a new country code in your system. It would make much more sense to use items that are common. But one of the most common things we always get tripped up about is the use of UK versus GB. The ISO country code is GB. It is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, one of the longer names. And we probably do have one of the most complex identity crises in standards. And I have no idea what we will do if elements of devolution continue to go through. You'll notice that if you were to choose a county, it's also alongside at the same level as the perceived states or countries within the United Kingdom. So England is on the same level as Dorset, for example. So there are some challenges. It's not to say they don't exist. But it does mean that you've got common language to exchange data, and the CDR has now totally adopted the Accord standards. Otherwise, you will end up with some elements that are a little bit more challenging around what is going to be a successful outcome. So I've got a poll for people. I just have to work out how I run it because I can't see it on the screen. Show taskbar at the top there. Bear with me a second. Now I'm hoping this will come to the screen for you. Just take a couple of seconds, if you wouldn't mind, to quickly respond to, have you come across the term core data record? And by that I'm really talking about the CDR in the London market. If you're not sure, if it's not relevant, then obviously absolutely fine. And then when you have voted, I will show the results to people. So I'm very pleased to see that we've certainly got some yeses coming through. And if I now look at sharing those with you, you should see that obviously we have a couple of not sure or not relevant, but the vast majority, I'm glad to see people have heard about it. Some obviously haven't, and by all means do engage with your market representatives to pick up that story a little bit further. Let's carry on with the presentation. I think you need to click off the poll in order to be able to see it move on forwards. So what we now come to in the final elements of this is what the CDR in London is going to present to you. This is only a subset of the data, but you can see it really falls into some quite big chunky areas. There is data about contracts. These would be for price met policies, individual policies, as well as the master delegated authority contract. And the CDR is addressing insurance and FAC-RI in the reinsurance world first, but it will be moving through to delegated authority afterwards. Then there's quite a lot of information which is maybe going to fall potentially into the world of the MGA, which is collecting perhaps at least data that you are familiar with, but perhaps extending what that data is. And then also into the statement of values, schedule of values. So for marine, aviation and property, there would be a requirement to collect this data in structured form. And sadly, spreadsheets are not structured in that same way, although there may be transitional services. Your broker may offer you the ability to still accept spreadsheets for them to turn into structured data, but it's a market challenge one needs to look at. And then there's some financial data that you're more than familiar with, and then coverage and limits data that will be collected. So this is a sort of future-looking element, but really by adopting standards and slowly expanding out the data that you collect, as well as data you can leverage from third parties, will enable that transition to be more manageable. And that brings us on to the idea of that structured data, whether it's structured or unstructured, really is going to leverage that ability to be to have the utopian straight-through processing approach. We can't forget data integrity. Just as a byline at the end, you've collected all this data, but do make sure that there is a policy within your organisation to continually house clean this data. It isn't a once in a lifetime situation of collection and leave it be. You've got all sorts of challenges like countries changing their names, additional regions, maybe regions being retired. You can normally see that they are recorded on the standards body. For example, here we've got a newsletter in 2007, which talks about a subdivision of a country being retired. It's been deleted. And so you need to have a policy about how you address codes that are within your system and be able to take those on further. Adding codes is always the least destructive. Deleting codes is usually not permitted. Retiring codes can be handled reasonably easily, providing you have policy of what to do with history. And so you need this housekeeping to be an ongoing process as part of your digital and data strategy. So lastly, I have got a second poll. Just click back to my screen and make sure I pick up the right one. There we go. And we're going to start this one. Do you feel that your organisation is prepared for the upcoming changes? Now, those who felt it was not relevant or not sure are probably equally going to respond accordingly. But of those that replied yes and no, we're obviously going to hopefully see you indicate here whether you have got a sort of preparedness for what's going on. Just wait for the last of the attendees to vote. And then we'll show that result. So it looks as though we've got I would have to do obviously proper analysis behind the scenes with regards to whether the same people that said that they had heard it had obviously say that they're prepared. I rather assume that they will at least be a subset of the other. But we still have people who may feel as though they're not yet prepared, and some perhaps it's not their primary role and they're not sure, etc. Although interestingly, we had 2 votes for not relevant, and now we have 3 votes for not relevant. So there's always an interesting story behind any statistics. So just click off that again to be able to just take us to the last page of our presentation. And here is just to go back and begin to talk about opening up for questions, but also to just recap for the purposes of this particular presentation, that you hopefully have felt that you are able to get a better understanding of some of the values of data, what you can do with data enrichment to be able to leverage its value, to increase its value. Perhaps the cultural element is something that needs to be addressed in some organisations to be able to maximise that particular value. Some of the methods, lots of people talk about APIs. I often find people talk about APIs and would love somebody to actually explain what one was. And that's totally forgivable, where most insurance professionals are not also simultaneously people who write or deal with APIs daily. And then also why that communication, that sort of 2 ends of one to the other, and where your USP is, may not necessarily lie in the communication channel of that data, but also to keep that communication open using standards. So I'll hand back to our host, Julia, and maybe look to see whether there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Kirstin. A really informative session, lots of content, but some really valid points. I do have a couple of questions, actually. The first is, all for one common language on data, but all I can see is little or no engagement with software houses and expense to make the required changes. I'm not sure whether that's a question as much as a statement, but did you want to comment on that?
It's not an uncommon feeling I have definitely come across. So if we take, there's sort of 2 big camps of software houses, well 3 if you take the carrier market as well. You've got the carrier market, you have got the intermediary broker market, and you've got the MGA market. And obviously the audience has an interest here with regards to the MGA market. If your software house is supplying both London and non-London, then they're going to have a split dialogue with regards to what's necessary and what's not necessary. And they may also have a business case, the way that they conduct their business, to either lead by putting the data requirements in, putting the fields in for you to fill in, or to offer you those sort of APIs and leverages. You may have to pay for the subscription to them, but perhaps your software vendor has provided you with the ability to do those things, and disable and enable depending on whether you have the subscription to the data source. But if the software vendor is very much as a business process is, we do what our clients ask us to do, and there is a commercial relationship between them, then the onus has got to really be on the consumer, the MGA or the broker themselves, to be able to drive those requirements. And obviously, if there is a user group, there may be an element to leverage slightly more sort of impetus to be able to get those kinds of elements back. But software houses are not here as charities either, obviously representing one. And it really depends on how you engage with your software house, either as a group, which could leverage more power, or that the software house is actually trying to provide those services. Now, with my other hat on as Morning Data, rather than the LMA, we have put in almost all the fields for the CDR proactively. We have a very different model. We like to be able to try and take our clients on the journey. Our biggest challenge is persuading them to use the fields. So it's not always an easy thing that your vendor puts the fields in if you've still got a cultural element of, well, why am I having to actually capture all of this data? And there is obviously there's data you capture before or after different events that make it a little bit challenging. But yes, this is not an unrecognized or new question, and I sympathize, but I always use the analogy that the Inland Revenue did not go around asking everybody if they would be, what data they wanted or whether they'd be prepared to enter in data for online tax returns. They just mandated it, and if you didn't like it, you paid an accountant to do it for you.
Thank you. Another question. Do you see the cover holder reporting standards being changed to adopt or align with the new CDR for the London market?
That's a fascinating, it's a very, very valid question. So the first thing is the version 5.2 is still a standard which is written for a spreadsheet. It has no structure in terms of a data model really behind it. However, there have been elements that have been in the cover holder reporting standards which actually now you see them in the CDR. So, for example, the need to collect the industry code of the insured or the individual NIF or Fiscali code for the insured, depending on which country they're in. You now see those in the CDR. Now, the CDR has been signed off using Accord standards or to use Accord standards based on insurance and FAC-RI, and it will be going over to adopting the same approach for the master contract itself, so the contract of delegation, and then into the treaty world. And of course, if your contract of delegation is actually your binder, your line slip is already adopting certain drop-down lists and certain structures and approaches, those corresponding decks underneath those individual policies are going to need to be tweaked further to be able to align. So the answer is yes. I do see, I think on the timeline, it's somewhere towards the beginning of next year, where the focus will be on the delegated authority reporting standards. There has already been a lot of work to map the CDR to the current standards, but it evidently shows up the missing elements on the mapping.
Thank you for that. I don't have any other questions for the moment, so I'm going to start to wrap up. But before we do, if anybody would like to drop in a question in the chat box that we can put to Kirstin before we do finish, then do feel free. But it just really leaves me, other than that, to say, Kirstin, thank you so much. You're incredibly knowledgeable and certainly a great voice for Morning Data. And you know, some of the information that you've provided is really invaluable, and it was good to see the results of the poll as well, the two polls that you conducted. To our delegates, I can see there's no further questions, so I'd just like you to say thank you for dialing in today. We will be issuing a feedback survey for you to complete. I say that for each of our webinars. We really do feel it's important for you to have your voice on whether our webinars are providing content that suits you, that is valuable to you. So please do take a moment or two to complete the feedback survey. It really won't take very long, but it is hugely valuable. So Kirstin, thank you again to yourself and Morning Data, and thank you to our delegates for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.